morning, everybody. Welcome to another edition of the Lab 207 webcast. My name is Mr. Kite, and I will be hanging out with you today as we continue on in our series on the origins of life. Topic for the day is going to be the march towards land. Objectives for the day, or objective for the day, is as follows. Discuss major steps in the evolution of life on Earth and evidences used to support each step. Purpose of today is to look at the steps that scientists think life went through to get from the first single-celled organisms all the way up to the diversity of life that we see today. Moving through that progression, they are as follows. Let me get them all out there and then I will talk through them. So scientists basically think this is how things went down. On the right there is essentially like a clock of life, if you will. So first thing you got to do is get the first single-celled organisms. If I bring up my pen, you will see that on this clock representing life, first single-celled organisms start out right here, and they are represented by this purple line that travels all the way through. Next thing is the oxygen revolution. This is where you start seeing photosynthesis taking place, drastically changing the atmosphere. And right here, we've got a fully oxygenated atmosphere. So this is where we start photosynthesis. Obviously, it takes a really long time until we've got an atmosphere that is full of oxygen. Once you got that oxygenated atmosphere, we get our first eukaryotes showing up right here. Eukaryotes hang out for a long time in a single-celled state, and then we get to multicellularity. So those guys start working together. Next thing we have got is the Cambrian Explosion, which is going to show up somewhere in this area. That's where we get a huge diversity of life showing up. And then the last piece is the movement to land, which is probably going to happen somewhere right in here. Now, it's interesting to note, in this whole history of life, you can't even really see the human piece. We are like a thumbnail clipping right there in the grand scheme of the history of life on Earth. So let's talk about each one of these steps in detail. First thing we need to talk about is history. So the history of the Earth has been divided up into major eons, and then those eons have been further divided and subdivided all over the place. Scientists like to divide things. Recognize this. Each eon or each era is characterized by a certain type of fossil or life form that was alive at that time, and then there was some sort of catastrophe or major shift that caused a major extinction and then moved us into the next eon, where the survivors of whatever event killed off everything before evolve and become the next set of creatures. So there's the Archean period, that is the early Earth, Proterozoic, and then the Phanerozoic. We are presently in the Phanerozoic. That era is broken down into the Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic. Currently, we are living in the Cenozoic era. Sorry for that edit. In the history of life, we need to get to our first single-celled organisms. The first fossil evidence of single-celled life shows up about 3.5 billion years ago in the form of a stromatolite. On the right-hand side there you see a picture of stromatolites. Stromatolites are essentially communities of prokaryotic organisms living together, and they form a film that binds together sediment. Each of those little like rocky, pillowy looking things is a stromatolite, and they build on top of each other. So one layer of these little organisms will bind together sediment and cause a hard, crusty layer. Then the next layer builds on top of them and on top of them and on top of them, and so on and so forth. So first fossil evidence of single-celled organisms that we have are stromatolites from 3.5 billion years ago. Next move we make is towards photosynthesis and the oxygen revolution. Fossil evidence of this shows up about 2.7 billion years ago in a couple of forms. So the first thing is fossils of organisms that seem to resemble cyanobacteria, which is something we have now on Earth. Cyanobacteria are pictured there on the right, and they're a blue-green-ish bacteria that is capable of carrying out photosynthesis. Scientists also think that this is the period in Earth's history where our environment began to become oxygen-rich. Proof that they have for that is in I guess fossils or rock layers that would have been under the ocean during this time. They find areas that are very red with rust. Now the reason that's important is because they think that back then the atmosphere in the oceans would have been very rich in iron, As the concentration of oxygen in the ocean and in the atmosphere increased, the oxygen and the iron would have connected together, forming rust. So that would have precipitated to the bottom of the ocean, forming layers of rust sediment. Also, terrestrial fossils and rock layers from this time period show that rocks also, which were rich in iron at the time, oxidized, so that is evidence that there was also a lot of oxygen in the atmosphere. So scientists basically say, all right, if we see all of these rocks that suddenly rusted out, the iron oxidized, there must have been an increasing proportion of oxygen in the atmosphere, and we are seeing fossils of something that look like cyanobacteria. So put those two together, and they think that photosynthesis started somewhere around 2.7 billion years ago, and then from there the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere began to increase. Next step in our march towards land is eukaryotes. We have talked about endosymbiotic theory. That is the idea that at some point in time, prokaryotes began to live symbiotically inside of larger cells, forming the first organelles. The thought is that mitochondria were probably the first organelle, and then after them, chloroplasts or their related plastids. The first fossils that seem to lend evidence to this idea are from 2.1 billion years ago. They're pictured there on the right, and just as a reminder, support for endosymbiotic theory are things like the membranes of mitochondria and chloroplasts are selectively permeable in many of the same ways that prokaryotic membranes are. They've got their own DNA, they've got their own ribosomes, they're capable of replicating and dividing on their own, and they produce their own energy. So evidence for that, again, supported by fossils shown on the right there from 2.1 billion years ago. So we've got eukaryotic organisms. The next thing we need is those eukaryotic organisms to start living together, moving us towards multicellularity. First evidence of multicellularity shows up about 1.5 billion years ago in the form of small communal algae that were living together. There is precedent now even for algae living together. Any kelp, seaweed, things like that, that's essentially a collection of algae. But the stuff from 1.5 billion years ago would have been much smaller communities than seaweed that we see now. By 575 million years ago, we start to see a diverse variety of multicellular eukaryotes fossilized in the fossil record. Once we got multicellularity, there is an explosion that happens, and Cambrian Explosion is one of those things that scientists look at and they kind of scratch their heads, and there's still a lot of thought going on around this. For some reason, around 535 million years ago, well, from 535 million years ago to 525 million years ago, there was this huge explosion of diversity on the scene where a lot of the present-day phyla of plants and animals and fungi suddenly show up on the scene. They weren't present in the fossil record previously. They just kind of, boom, in this 10 million year period all show up, which in our brains 10 million years seems like a long time, but if you look at the grand scale of geological time, it's just a blip on the radar. That's why it's called the explosion. A lot of scientists have done genetic analysis of these creatures to try to figure out whether this was like a random set of mutations that happened or if it had been kind of building for a long time. Current evidence is showing that the genes necessary to make this explosion happen were present long before the Cambrian explosion. It's just during this time period events conspired to get novel combinations going on that gave us new body plans and things like that. Start seeing armoring on animals, you start seeing adaptations to become a predator, and you start really seeing natural selection go into work with the Cambrian explosion. And then final step is the invasion of land. And this first fossil evidence of organisms living on land come from about 500 million years ago. And this is essentially the adapt or die phase. Living in water, in a lot of ways, is fairly easy. You don't need any structural support for your body because the water supports you. You've got all the nutrients you need dissolved around you or coming from the sun. Don't have to worry about drying out when you're reproducing. You don't have to worry about your eggs or sperm or embryos drying out. Like, it's a lot easier. Moving towards land, you've got to start to conquer problems of how do I as an organism keep from drying out? How do I reproduce, which requires moisture, but not have that moisture available? If I am a plant or an animal, how do I transport fluids within me in order to stay alive, since I can't just absorb it from the outside environment? So when we move towards land, we start to see fungi showing up that are capable of absorbing a lot of things. You see vascular plants showing up that have got these structures inside them for transporting water. You see animals showing up that have got vascular systems. You see adaptations such as a cuticle in a plant, which is waxy and it prevents water loss. You see reptiles with scales to prevent water loss. So all that starts showing up after 500 million, well, I guess about 500 million years ago, and it's essentially a set of adaptations needed for survival on land. And then as far as geologic history goes, humans in roughly present form show up about 195,000 years ago. So if you remember that first clock I showed, we are just a little sliver in geologic time. I hope that this video gave you a little bit of perspective on the ideas about how we got from single-celled life to life here on Earth. Thank you for joining us on the Lab 207 webcast. My name is Mr. Kite, and we'll see you again.